Okay, so Jeff is an interdisciplinary ethics fellow at Stanford University, based in the Center for Ethics in Society and the Institute for Human-Centered Artificial Intelligence. This is his first year as a postdoc at Stanford. He finished his PhD at the University of Bristol last May, working on the ethics of automated vehicles. And I should say that I was one of his PhD supervisors. Richard Pettigrew was the other and much better PhD supervisor for Jeff. But I confess that Jeff and I have a long-standing connection. His research explores a range of disputes in ethics and law of artificial intelligence. Right now, he's working on ethical decision-making under severe uncertainty for automated vehicles, and the ethics of targeted advertising, and the ethics of medical decision support systems. I should have said as well that he's not only an interdisciplinary fellow at Stanford, but also an associate fellow of the Leverhulme Center for the Future of Intelligence at University of Cambridge. Okay, so that's the spiel on Jeff. And now I think we'll move to Jeff's own presentation. Take it away, Jeff.
Thank you very much, Brad, for that introduction. It's a great pleasure to be back speaking at Ethical Reading. Really glad to be here. Today, I'm going to be talking about a really contentious topic, which is trolley problems and their relation to the ethics of automated vehicles. So the question I want to ask is the following. What, if anything, is the relevance of the trolley problem to the ethics of automated vehicles? Does the trolley problem imply anything of interest about disputes about the ethical design and regulation of automated vehicles? Now, there's a standard answer to this question, and that is no. The trolley problem has absolutely nothing of interest to tell us about how we should design automated vehicles in an ethical way. And the standard argument that's given for that position runs something like this. Trolley problems are vanishingly unlikely to occur on real roads. So without evidence that such situations would occur, it's just unhelpful to consider them when thinking about automated vehicle policymaking. So the thought, I take it, is something like this. It is overwhelmingly unlikely that an automated vehicle would find itself in circumstances where there's 5 people in front of it and it's heading towards those 5 people and it's going to hit them. And the only way it can avoid hitting those 5 people is to swerve off in another direction where conveniently another person is placed and it will kill that person instead. The thought is that that situation is just not going to happen. And maybe you could set things up so that it would happen by maybe making the brakes fail or putting ice on the road or something like that. But the thought is, other things being equal, we really have no reason to think that these situations are going to occur in practice. And because the trolley problem is about should you kill 5 or should you kill 1, it's just not obvious that there would be any good reason to think that the trolley problem would give us, useful ethical insights into the kind of problems that arise for automated vehicles. What I want to argue today is that this argument is in some way confused. The claim I want to defend is the following. The relevance of the trolley problem to automated vehicles does not depend on whether or not those vehicles will encounter dilemmatic collisions in the road. So what I mean is, we can grant for the sake of argument that these kind of tragic choices are never going to arise, and it still remains an open question whether the trolley problem has interesting things to tell us about the ethics of automated vehicles. Now notice, I'm not defending the strong claim today. I'm not going to say that trolley problems have novel and interesting things to tell us about the ethics of automated vehicles. Rather, all I'm going to say is that even if we grant that these kind of tragic choices will never arise on the road, it might still be the case that the trolley problem has interesting things to tell us. So we shouldn't just dismiss it out of hand because these cases seem implausible or unlikely. So here's the plan. First, I'm going to talk about what the trolley problem is, and I'm going to try and clear up a few misconceptions that people have. I don't think people are blameworthy for having those misconceptions. I think the trolley problem is systematically misrepresented in the media and in, sometimes even in papers by philosophers. And then once I've done that, I'm going to look at how the trolley problem might, in principle, inform the ethics of automated vehicles and give a kind of indication of the sort of reasoning that might go on to draw ethical conclusions out of these kinds of thought experiments. So this is what most people think the trolley problem is. There's a scenario where there's a train or a tram or a trolley, and it's heading towards 5 people, and if the trolley isn't stopped, those 5 people are going to die. They're going to get run over. And conveniently, you are standing by a lever, which, if pulled, will divert the trolley onto a sidetrack, in which case it will run over 1 person instead. And you can have an argument about whether or not there's good reason to pull that lever, right? So on some views, like certain forms of utilitarianism, you ought to pull the lever. And the reason why that is that what matters is bringing about the best consequences. And killing 1 person is a better consequence than killing 5. It's better to have 1 dead person rather than 5 dead people. On the other hand, you might adopt what's called a deontological view, and you might say something like, well, it's morally wrong to kill someone, but it is morally permissible to let 5 people die if the alternative is killing someone, and therefore you ought not pull the lever, right? So those are 2 views you might take about this kind of situation. And what's at issue when people think, the trolley problem is in some way irrelevant to automated vehicles, is that they think the way in which the trolley problem might be relevant is what should the automated vehicle do if it faces a relevantly analogous situation? What should the vehicle do if it's going to plow into 5 people and the only way to stop that is to plow into 1 person, right? So this whole way of thinking about the trolley problem is the basis for what I call the not going to happen argument, right? So this argument has 2 premises. The first premise says, well, trolley problems are only relevant to real-world collisions where harming at least 1 person is unavoidable, and a choice is required about how to distribute harms between multiple parties. The second premise is, well, these collisions just aren't going to happen. Let's be realistic. This isn't going to happen, or if it does happen, it's going to happen very, very rarely, to the point where there's no good reason to take it seriously. And then the conclusion is, well, trolley cases are irrelevant to the ethics of automated vehicles. Okay, so as promised, what I'm going to do is grant the second premise. I'm just going to assume that these cases aren't going to happen. What I take issue with is the first premise. I think the first premise relies on a conception of the trolley problem which doesn't really understand what philosophers are trying to get at when they talk about these problems. So rather than thinking about the trolley problem as the question, should I pull the lever, I'm going to introduce you to the way philosophers tend to think about this problem, which is to contrast 2 cases against each other and ask how we can explain the difference in our intuitions across those 2 cases. So let's look at these 2 cases. So in the first case, we've got a transplant surgeon called David, and David has 5 patients. And all of those patients need a particular organ very urgently. So one of them needs a heart, one of them needs a liver, one needs a stomach, one needs a spleen, and one needs a spinal cord. But all of these people have a really rare blood type. Now, someone then walks into the hospital. Perhaps they're collecting their blood test results, and it turns out that that person has exactly the right blood type. Now, David, our surgeon, sees an opportunity. He thinks, well, I guess what I could do is just take that person and kill them and harvest their organs and put them into the 5 patients, right? That is something David could do. And I think most people take the view that that would be morally impermissible. David would be committing some kind of moral wrong if he took that random healthy person, killed them, harvested their organs, and put them in the 5 patients, right? David would almost certainly be struck off the GMC register if he did that. He would probably go to prison for a very long time. Now contrast that with some other case. Suppose that Edward is a train driver and the brakes fail, and he's headed towards the 5 people, and these people are going to die if the train continues. Now, Edward could divert the train onto a sidetrack, in which case it will kill 1 person. Now, here's the odd thing. Most people think it's actually morally permissible for Edward to divert the trolley in those circumstances. They think, if the choice is between killing 5 and killing 1, then, well, it seems better to kill 1. Now, what the trolley problem really is how you explain the difference between these 2 cases. Because in both cases, the choice is between killing 5 people or killing 1 person. And yet, in the transplant case, it seems impermissible to kill 1 to save 5. And yet, in the trolley case, it seems permissible to kill 1 to save 5. So what the trolley problem demands is an explanation for the difference in those 2 judgments. What is the difference between the 2 cases that explains why in one case it's permissible to kill 5 to save 1, or sorry, to kill 1 to save 5, but in the other case it's not? Now, what kind of explanation might we give in that case? Well, there's a huge dispute about this, and the trolley problem literature in philosophy is about what the best explanation for this difference is. So the original explanation was given by Philippa Foot in a paper back in the 1960s. And Foot's explanation was to distinguish between two different kinds of duties, which she called positive duties and negative duties. So what Foot says is, in the transplant case, there's two duties at issue. One is a positive duty to aid 5 people, and the other is a negative duty not to kill 1 person. And Foot thought that the duty not to kill is actually stronger than the duty to aid 5 people. In contrast, in the Trolley case, there's just 2 duties not to kill. There's the duty not to kill 1 and the duty not to kill 5. And when those 2 duties are compared, it's better to kill 1 person than it is to kill 5 people. But the reason we have a difference in judgment is that in one case, it's kill 1 versus kill 5, whereas in the other case, it's kill 1 versus fail to aid 5. Okay, so that's an explanation you might disagree with, right? That's just Foot's view, and certain people have defended other explanations, and almost no one believes Foot anymore. But this is just an illustration of the kind of explanation you might give for the difference in the 2 cases. Okay, so what I want to say is that the trolley problem illustrates the kind of methodology that you might use to formulate moral principles and to test moral principles. What you do is you take 2 cases, which seem to hold fixed all the morally salient facts except 1. And then you tweak that 1 fact and show that it makes a difference to your moral judgment. In one case, the agent acts rightly, in the other, the agent acts wrongly. And then what you do is you formulate a moral principle that explains why it is that tweaking that feature of the cases changes the judgment, right? And that's a kind of methodological tool that we use in moral philosophy to decide what kinds of principles explain the rightness or wrongness of acts. We develop really, really simple cases so that we can hold fixed all the morally relevant facts except 1, and then just tweak that 1 fact to show that it makes a difference. Okay, so what the lesson is here is that it doesn't really matter whether or not trolley cases happen in the real world, because the whole point of the cases is to make them as simple as possible, right? We're not really interested in what to do in the event of railway disasters. Almost no philosophers, except maybe Joe Wolfe, are interested in the question, you know, what should you do in a railway disaster? It's just not what the trolley problem literature is about. And to illustrate this, you can see that the first paper on the trolley problem, Foot's paper, was about abortion. It wasn't about train crashes, right? This was just an arbitrary, simple case that was picked to illustrate a particular moral point, right? And this is why it doesn't really matter if automated vehicles will ever find themselves in tragic choices, because it may be the case that thinking about very, very, very simple cases can nevertheless help us think about which moral principles regulate automated vehicle behavior, both in collision scenarios, but also in normal driving. So the question remains, can the trolley problem help us with the ethics of automated vehicles? And I don't really have a strong view on this. I think the proof is in the pudding. I think if people come up with plausible moral principles off the back of trolley cases, then sure, trolley cases can inform the ethics of automated vehicles in some interesting way. But I don't think we can judge from the armchair whether or not these cases are going to be helpful. But what I can do is show you what sort of thing trolley people might say about the ethics of automated vehicles. And I can do that by looking at a real-world collision and thinking about how they may think about it. So on March the 18th, 2018, a lady called Elaine Hertzberg was crossing the road in dark clothes with her bicycle at about 9 o'clock in the evening. And a driverless Uber was driving down the road pretty fast. And the person driving the Uber wasn't paying attention, so the Uber was driving itself. About 6 seconds prior to the collision, the Uber detected an object, but it didn't know what it was, so it classifies it as an unknown. A little bit later, it classifies it as a vehicle, and then as a bicycle, and then it hits Elaine Hertzberg, and she dies. What this case illustrates, or at least what I want to take out of it, is that there's some kind of morally significant issue about classification errors with driverless cars. So, you know, there are certain moral questions that we can just bracket, like should the driver have been paying attention, you know, should the vehicle's brakes have been deactivated, which they were, and just focus on the morally salient issue, which is that a classification error was made and somebody died as a consequence. Now, there's an interesting moral question here, which is, should a vehicle's actions be judged based on what is in fact going on in its environment, you know, based on the fact that there is a person crossing the road? Or should the vehicle's actions be judged based on what it predicts about what's going on in its environment? Because there's a disparity here between what the vehicle thought was the case and what was actually the case. And there's a moral question we can ask about whether to judge the vehicle's actions in terms of their rightness or wrongness, in terms of the predictions, or in terms of what's actually going on. Now, we can actually use trolley cases to think about these cases. And I apologize if any anti-trolley people are frightened about this. The government is currently incorporating this particular case into a report, which is quite scary because I came up with it as a kind of joke. But the thought is, imagine there's a person dressed in a bush costume at the side of the road. They're on their way to a fancy dress party. An automated vehicle is driving down the road. It sees the bush, or the person dressed as a bush, and it classifies that person as a bush. Accordingly, the vehicle doesn't slow down. There's no reason to slow down for bushes, but this pedestrian isn't really paying attention. They step out into the road and splat, they're dead. Okay, my judgment in this case is that the automated vehicle does not act wrongly in failing to slow down for a pedestrian dressed as a bush. I think it's perfectly reasonable to classify the object as a bush and not to slow down. And you might think that a plausible explanation for that is that automated vehicles are morally permitted to act in accordance with their predictions about the morally relevant features of the situation. In this case, that there is no pedestrian at the side of the road. But there's another trolley case waiting around the corner. So suppose there's a pedestrian in a high visibility jacket, and they're standing at the side of the road. The automated vehicle classifies the pedestrian as a bush, and then it fails to slow down, pedestrian steps out, and splat, they're dead. It seems in this case that the vehicle probably does act wrongly. Right, it classified someone in a high visibility jacket as a bush and then failed to slow down. And you might think then that it's false, that the vehicle is permitted to act in accordance with its predictions. You might instead think that a better principle is something along the lines of the vehicle is morally permitted to act in accordance with its justified predictions about the morally relevant fact. So the thought is there's some kind of epistemic standard, some standard about reasonable or rational belief in the situation that applies to the vehicle and puts a limit on the kind of predictions it's permitted to act in accordance with, right? So you might think it has to have good reason to think that the object is a bush before it can be let off the hook for failing to slow down, right? So that's just one example of the kind of principle you might come up with by reflecting on trolley cases, even though the cases are completely ridiculous and involve people dressed as bushes and will probably never happen. Okay, so just to summarize, it doesn't matter that AVs will not encounter trolley cases in the real world, because the point of these cases is to develop and test moral principles in idealized scenarios where we can hold fixed the relevant facts and set aside all the noise. Nevertheless, I think it's an open question whether and to what extent these cases will be useful in AV ethics, and I think we'll just have to see whether moral philosophers come up with useful applications of these cases to the kind of questions that we're really concerned about when designing these vehicles. What I'll do now is quickly sketch a few discussion questions that we can talk about in the break, and then I'll give you an opportunity to ask any questions about the questions, should the questions be unclear. So the first question is, does what the AV ought to do depend on what is in fact the case, or on its predictions about what is the case, or on its justified predictions about the case? I'd really like to get people's opinions about whether we should index the moral permissions and the moral wrongness of the AV's acts to what is the case, what it thinks is the case, or what it has good reason to think is the case. Okay, the second question is, can we think of some trolley cases to motivate whatever answer we give to one? And here I'm construing trolley cases pretty broadly. So any kind of abstract, unrealistic, fun case, you're welcome to use to adjudicate between the different answers to question one. And then the third question is, how important do we think it is that trolley cases are realistic? Sure, you can have some leeway, you can put a person in a bush costume, but maybe there's only so far you can go, and how far can you divorce yourself from the actual circumstances of AV collisions in order to have kind of meaningful ethical examples? So those are the three questions. If anyone has any questions about the questions, feel free to ask now.
Can you just clarify on case one, who is bearing the justification of those predictions, please? Yeah,
so the thought is that there is some kind of standard, and you can do this in different ways, right? So you could say there is an objective fact of the matter, given the evidence available to the car, whether or not that belief is justified, right? So you might think, there's certain features which the car detects, like say green leaves, roundness, non-reflectiveness, stuff like that. And you might just think there's a fact of the matter, given the set of features that the car has detected, whether or not there's good reason to predict that it is a bush, right? Or you might run it a different way and just say that statistically, given a well-tested algorithm that has been through a process of quality control, it should have been the case that the entity was classified as a bush, given any plausible standard for quality control. So that's a bit more of a light way of doing it, where you're not committing yourself to objective standards for reasonable belief, but rather just kind of plausible quality control standards. Does that make sense?
Yes, thank you.
Hi, can I ask a question? I suppose two related things. Firstly, automate machines don't make moral choices. You can't use moral terms to talk about machines. So ultimately, I guess we're talking about the programmers of the machines, not the actual machines themselves. And secondly, the automated vehicle can't do anything other than act on its predictions. It can't. It's all it's got to work with. It doesn't know what is the case because it's only got its predictions. Presumably it's going to be operating on its best predictions, and that's kind of all there is. That's all it can do, and that's all that the programmer can work with as well.
Yeah, I see. So I guess I'd say two things about that. One is that it's not entirely clear that the automated vehicle can't make choices which are morally evaluable. Right. So you may think it doesn't make sense to hold the vehicle responsible or to punish it or something like that, but you may nevertheless think that the vehicle can act in ways that are right or wrong.
No. It's like saying, so if a knife cuts me, I blame the knife for cutting, but it's cut me.
Well, no, because notice that what you did there was say, it's absurd to blame the knife. And I agree, it's absurd to hold a vehicle accountable, but that doesn't imply that the vehicle can't do actions which are right or wrong. Okay, the salient difference between a knife and an automated vehicle is that an automated vehicle ultimately works in a reinforcement learning framework whereby it's choosing between actions and it's doing that to maximize some sense of utility. But it's ultimately an agent in the minimal sense of it's representing the world, it's choosing between actions. And you might think that actions of that kind are morally valuable, right? That's at the very least not an absurd view, right?
Yes. Well, if it's a machine, you can have more or less complicated machines, but at the end of the day, it's just an inanimate object that's been made to behave in a certain way by the human being that developed it.
So this is plausibly something that we should talk about in the discussion session rather than having this argument now, because there's a lot of considerations that you might bring to the table. What I would say, though, is that automated vehicles do have a degree of autonomy beyond just doing what their programmers tell them, right? They're not just simply good old-fashioned AI, rule-following machines. They have a fair amount of autonomy to navigate their environment within reasonable parameters.
The criteria they use is always what's been programmed into them ultimately. But anyway, we can talk about it later.
Yeah, we should chat about that later. Cool. There was a second question though, right? In addition to whether or not the vehicle had actions which were morally valuable, there was a second question, I think.
Yeah, which is that it can't do anything other than act on its predictions. So
I see.
How the three things come apart there.
Right. So you might think the same thing is true of humans, right? So I can only act conditional on my information about the world, but that doesn't imply that the standard you would hold me to is just my predictions, because I might have very irrational beliefs, right? I might, I might come across a box which says on the front of it that there's a person inside this box, and I could have a big sledgehammer and hit the box. Right, that would be a bad thing to do because, I have every reason to expect that there's a person in the box, but I may just form an irrational belief and think the box is empty despite the fact there's a sign on it that says there's a person in it. Right, so it seems like the same thing would apply for humans, and that there's still a question about whether we should care about whether there is a person in the box, whether I believe there's a person in the box, or whether I have good reason to believe there's a person in the box.
And I suppose that comes back to the first question, which is, so in the human being's case, you'd say I'm to blame for forming that stupid belief, and in the automatic vehicle case, you'd say, well, the programmer's to blame for making it create such bad predictions or something like that.
Yeah, kind of. So blame isn't really the issue. So somebody can do something wrong without being blamed. For example, if you excused somebody, They may have extenuating circumstances. Maybe they were acting under duress, and there's an example of somebody that acts wrongly, but is not blameworthy. So blame and wrongdoing come apart.
Cool. I think everybody's back now. So over to you, Brad.
Right. Okay. So I think there were maybe 4 breakout rooms. Does that sound right? I was in room 4, so there were at least 4. So would somebody from the first room, breakout room 1, like to report on what happened there? Or what the main points of the discussion were? Who was in breakout room 1 is willing to report?
Can I nominate Ellie? She was leading the discussion.
Okay.
Thanks. Well, oh no, I'm trying to remember what we said. We spoke about lots of different things. We kind of went off on various tangents and thought about different philosophical thought experiments relating to all different kinds of decisions and technologies. But with the car situation, I think we all agreed that it would be the third scenario. So the justified predictions. And we had an interesting discussion about what counts as a justified prediction. And everything that goes on there. We disagreed that I think we disagreed anyway, that the Bush scenario would count as a justified prediction because presumably the technology could be made better so that you can recognize that a walking bush is not just a bush, it's a person. I don't know, have I missed out anything there? What else we discussed?
Jerry then had some...
Go on.
Jerry had some real life cases that we discussed.
Good.
We could have done with another 15 minutes, I think.
Good. Great. Okay, so how about room 2? Who's the spokesperson for room 2?
I'm not quite sure quite what numbers our rooms were actually.
Yes, we were too, Dan.
Okay, great. So the first thing was with regard to the sort of the moral issue. We thought maybe rather than talk about, we've got the complex notion of blame, responsibility, and so on. I mean, ultimately the question is what shall we do? And you've got the question of what should the programmer do? What should the government do? In other words, what should they legislate? So there's that issue. So just focus on what should be done, and then we distinguish between obviously you've got the people programming the computer, programming the machines. You've got the legislators, and then there's also the legal side. When you're going to allow people to sue, what sort of standards you hold the vehicles to. So Nick was saying about how you talk to the police about this, and the standard they probably use is just would it be better or worse than a normal human driver? So if a human driver would have whacked into this bush that suddenly walked into the road, then presumably we can't complain about the car. And Robert also was drawing attention to the fact, we do have airplanes and the doctrines like railway that are, do a lot of autonomous actions. And when we saw the Boeing Max crash recently, a lot of people killed. And again, that was a problem with the designers of the aircraft. We don't blame the aircraft for that, even though the aircraft does do quite a lot independently. It's definitely the designers that we blame. And the other main thing was Nick was saying about how, do we look at the overall number of deaths that would be saved if we switch to autonomous vehicles, or so as long as the overall number is less, is that okay, or does it have to be a lower number in each bracket, so the lower number of people killed in hitting car crashes and a lower number of pedestrians killed? Because it might be that the hitting car crashes get reduced massively because the cars can communicate with each other, and so they know to all slow down at the same time so they don't crash, whereas pedestrians are pretty difficult to pick out. So it might be you get lower car-to-car crashes but slightly higher pedestrian crashes, and is what counts the overall thing, or does it have to be better in each category before you allow it?
Great. Very rich discussion. Okay, how about room 3? Hello, room 3?
Was that our room? I can't.
Must be, because
do you guys want me to be the spokesman, or do one of you want to do it? Cool. Okay, so on question 1, we talked a bit about quality assurance and how that might speak in favor of a kind of objective view of the standard we hold the car to. So the thought is that actually when we evaluate how safe cars are, we do so in accordance with kind of objective facts of the matter about what's going on, and we hope the car will achieve some kind of objective standard there. Question 2, we didn't actually come up with a case. And what was question 3? Sorry, these are my own questions. Oh yeah, trolley problems being realistic. Yeah, so the thought there was, we thought that there was a kind of fairly broad scope to actually come up with some pretty wacky cases, as long as your logical argumentation for the kinds of points being made was robust. But we did also flag this worry that if you go too far out of the normal situation, it might be the case that the factors in the cases start interacting in really weird ways that kind of undermine the kind of conclusions you're trying to draw. Cool, that was about it. If anyone has anything else to add, I have the memory of a sieve.
Yeah, I think I would just want to comment on ought to depend on what is the case. Just to clarify the bush example, right? I don't care if the vehicles recognize this as a bush versus not a bush. I really don't care. It's not supposed to be a classifier of bushes versus non-bushes. There could be someone behind the bush. So that's a very important, it's, whether there's an obstacle that ought to be avoided. And one should be careful by falling into the trap of bushes versus not bush, is just to come back on that point, which I wanted to bring. Is it an obstacle? Is it an obstacle that ought to be avoided at all costs? Becomes then the question, or not? Because maybe it's better to go into the obstacle knowing that at this speed, the airbags, all of this will protect the people inside, and whoever was on the side of that supposedly obstacle looking like a bush, if there was someone there and that you couldn't, that you would have hit, then it would be better to hit the obstacle. But it is now there where it matters to see if it is an obstacle I would go through, an obstacle I can really hit hard or not. And this is where we can have a sort of discussion about material recognition. But the point is not whether it's a bush, whether it's an obstacle of what kind, that I would like to clarify about what it means to be the case. The case here is an abstraction of all its features of the world that needs to be taken into consideration. It's like some features are relevant, some of them are not relevant. I hope this helps.
So now can we go to room 4, which is Claire, I think is going to report. Claire, you've got to demute yourself there. Great.
Hi everyone. So as I said in my group, sorry for the French accent and the bad English. You will have to cope with it. I'm sorry. So to begin the discussion, because it is a tough subject, we thought, what if we forget that this is a machine driving and we think instead of a human? What are we going to expect from that human driver? And most probably we're going to adjust what we are thinking and the liability, etc. We're going to adjust to the person abilities. So are you wearing glasses? Are you tired because you work late? I don't know. We are going to be maybe more kind toward the person, because we know that this situation might have happened to us also. But when it is a machine, we expect the machine to be perfect, or at least to be better than humans, because we have been taught that machines are great and superior to humans. And if you listen to medias, machines are going to make the human world so weird because we are so inferior to machines. So we have this idealistic image of what machines are supposed to be. But obviously, a machine is not perfect. And even if the creator of an AI system tries to imagine all the possible situations to make the algorithm learn all these possible situations, it is very probable that you will find someone somewhere trying to break the system. The example I had was the guy cycling on a motorway with a stop sign at his back, and he was just in front of an automated car, and the car braked and accelerated and braked and accelerated and braked because the sign, the stop sign, was obviously something to take into account, but it was on a bicycle, and the system chose to not take into account the pedestrian on his bicycle, but to take into account the signalization. So as I said, this is a quite funny example because no harm was done, but you will always find someone trying to misguide the system, and unfortunately, sometimes it's not going to end very well. So human beings also have to take their responsibilities when trying to mess up with AI algorithms. That's about it for me.
Well done, Claire. That was great. Now, is there a room 5? Were there 5 breakout rooms, Gerpert, or 4?
There were 4, Brian.
Oh, wonderful. Okay. So now I think we should give Jeff a few minutes to pick up on any of these things that have been raised and make some further comments, if he wants.
Gosh, I don't know. I mean, these were like all really, really, really interesting points. And I don't know. I think one thing that I did maybe want to say something on is, and I can't remember who said the point, but it was something like holding the automated vehicle to the same standard as we would hold a human. And I think there are a bunch of really interesting questions that arise, in particular about predictions and, you know, what the standards for reasonable beliefs are for humans are versus what the standards are for automated vehicles. Because it's important to see that the way an automated vehicle, you know, sees the world, if it's like, you know, deciding whether or not to predict that something is a bush, you know, it has this huge like list of like properties, like numerical properties, and then it does all these weird transformations on it, and eventually reaches a prediction. And it's like the kind of properties that the vehicle will take as salient will have no natural interpretation to us, right? They will be things that are totally meaningless. And it's unclear to me that, you know, the things we take as reasons to believe actually apply to automated vehicles, such that it's unclear what it even means to hold a vehicle to the same standard as a human with its predictions, because it doesn't have the same reasons that we do. It just takes different features of its scenarios as reasons to believe things. So I think at the very least, one of the challenges for the view that we should hold vehicles to the same standard as humans is to actually kind of work out what that really means. Is it like a human in similar situation would, you know, believe whatever, or is it like, you know, we would expect a human with relevantly similar evidence to believe it? Like, does anybody have any thoughts on like what exactly it would amount to hold an automated vehicle to the same kind of standard for reasonable belief as a human? Because I'm not really sure.
Yeah, I think it's a very good question. This is why there's a framework around explainable AI, because it's not just autonomous vehicle that will face that challenge. And as consumer for whom AI is made, as a society, that discussion will crop every time. And it's not a good answer to say it's a black box. No, it's not. I want to know where the data come from, especially historical data, where we know have a lot of bias there around certain minority groups, depending on, you know, stuff like this, all the way down to who is the board behind, you know, whether some diversity check and balances. So that's why I shared something. I share the assessment list of trustworthy artificial intelligence AI from the EU as well, which is also that trust. Like, how can you convince a legislator, other stakeholders to support that mass transformation of vehicles if you don't give them reason to believe that it is trustworthy, and where this will come from, and auditing. So if you can't open the box, you can't audit. If you can't audit, and I'm sorry, we're giving up. So for all these various reasons, I would say, yes, the standards are different than humans. You're right, we should, but they should be understandable for humans. That would be my take on that.
It isn't what counts ultimately whether you get hit by the car or not. So regardless of whether you understand why or why not you're hit by a car, ultimately what counts is how it works. And that's going to be a mixture of lots of things, including how quickly it processes, what the algorithm is, how all sorts of things, how good the vision thing is, and so ultimately it's the proof of the pudding's in the eating, I would have thought.
Is it really the numbers, as in, so for example, how many get killed, or things like, do we really know the ethnicity or the, the age of the people killed and so forth? And also, because we can't ever relive the world. So if we didn't have them, humans would become more intelligent as a species and more equal anyway. So in a more equal society, we would have fewer deaths anyway, and that's an entirely different discussion. But if we then compare the different scenarios, we can't really say, oh, we have fewer deaths with these new cars than what we did before, because even without them, we should really have fewer than deaths. So what are the data that you really compare? And I think that's why what is in the black box should be really understood really much better.
So we've got a measure of agreement. That's terrific.
Well, I'm not sure. Hang on. Steady on, Brad.
No, we did. We did. We agree. We got the black box is not shut. Can't be left shut. Yeah, we agree.
Well, I know. I'm not sure I do agree.
There is a degree of agreement, but I think you'll all agree with me that this has been an interesting discussion. We should thank Jeff for his presentation. And I just want to say that I've learned a lot from the discussion and have enjoyed meeting some new faces and some new people. So thank you very, very much for coming. I hope you'll come back to an Ethical Reading event in the future. In the meantime, cheers.
All right.
Thank you.
Thank you, Jeff. Fantastic.
Thank you, everyone.
Thanks, Brad.